Imagine for a second, right, that you are walking down this incredibly crowded city street.
Nope, like right in the middle of the morning rush hour.
Exactly. Rush hour, you're running late, your mind is just completely racing through a mental checklist of the day's tasks, and your eyes are glued to a text message on your
A
phone.
very familiar scenario.
Right, and suddenly, somebody bumps into you. Hard.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, your coffee just sloshes right over the rim, it burns your hand, completely stains your shirt. Now, in that split second, before your higher level logic or like empathy kicks in, what flashes through your mind about that other person?
Probably not their complex inner life.
Right. Chances are you don't instantly conceptualize them as a complex, three-dimensional individual. You definitely aren't thinking about their childhood memories or their deep-seated fears.
Or the fact that they might be, I don't know, rushing to a hospital.
Exactly. In that specific fraction of a second, your brain likely categorizes them simply as an obstacle, just a nuisance.
Yeah, frustrating physical object that just got in your way.
So it's a totally mundane, everyday cognitive shortcut.
It is. I mean, we all do it just to survive the sheer sensory overload of modern life.
And here's the hook, the architecture of that shortcut, that ability to temporarily suspend our recognition of another person's inner world, well, it's the foundation of something much darker.
It really is.
Which brings us to the core of what we are unpacking today on this deep dive. Because we take that fleeting urban encounter, that tiny cognitive blind spot, and we magnify it, we systematize it.
And tragically, we weaponize it.
Exactly. We hear the word dehumanization thrown around constantly in our culture right now, don't we?
Oh, everywhere. Social media, the news, political commentary.
Right. And obviously in history books regarding the worst atrocities of the 20th century, we accuse each other of it all the time. But there is just this massive gap between using the word and actually understanding the machinery behind it.
There really is. People use it as a buzzword.
So our mission today, the whole point of this deep dive, is to ask, what is actually happening in the biological wiring of our brains and in the structural fabric of our societies when dehumanization occurs?
And getting to the bottom of that question requires navigating a pretty intense conceptual minefield, honestly.
Oh, sure.
Because while we all intuitively feel like we know what it means to treat someone as, less than human, pinning down the exact mechanics reveals some of the most surprising architecture of the human mind.
The stakes are incredibly high. How we define humanity, and more importantly, how we justify denying it to others, basically dictates the course of our history.
Exactly. And knowledge is really only valuable when it's applied, right? In an era of such intense political polarization and information overload, understanding these mechanics is kind of the ultimate tool for critical thinking.
So to do this, we are pulling from an incredibly dense, massive stack of interdisciplinary research you brought to the table, specifically the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's extensive entry on dehumanization.
Yeah, it's a huge, brilliant resource.
It is. We want to synthesize decades of research spanning moral philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, and history. We are looking for the true anatomy of this phenomenon.
And to do that, we actually have to start at the foundational fault line that divides the entire academic field on this topic.
Right, the great debate. Does dehumanization happen in our actions, or does it happen in our minds?
Put simply, do we dehumanize someone by how we treat them or by how we think about them?
Let's start with the treating side of things.
Okay, so the first major school of thought is completely pragmatic. It focuses entirely on the outside, on the treatment. This is known as the harms-based approach.
Harms-based.
Okay, the core argument here is that dehumanizing someone just means treating them in ways that actively harm or diminish their humanity. And frankly, it doesn't matter what you are secretly thinking in your head while you do it.
Oh, really? So the internal monologue is totally irrelevant.
Totally irrelevant to this camp. The damage to the victim is what counts. And thinkers in this camp often rely really heavily on Kantian philosophy.
Which usually comes down to the concept of autonomy, right? Like the idea that being human fundamentally means being the author of your own life.
That is the absolute crux of it. Philosophers like Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin approach this by arguing that certain capacities are central to the definition of a human being.
Capacities like autonomy.
Right. Autonomy, subjectivity, the ability to formulate your own desires and make choices. If you act in a way that overrides or undermines someone's autonomy, you are effectively stripping away their human status.
You're turning them into a commodity.
Exactly. You are treating them as a tool to be used rather than a person to be respected.
Okay, I understand the gravity of that when we are talking about extreme abuse. But if the definition is literally just treating someone as an instrument, I run into a practical problem.
What's the problem?
Well, we treat people as instruments all day long. Like, if I go into a diner and order breakfast, I am treating the waiter as an instrument to deliver my eggs and coffee. I am not deeply engaging with their autonomy or their life story. I literally just want my breakfast. Does the harms-based approach mean I'm dehumanizing the waiter?
No, and that exact problem is where the philosopher Martha Nussbaum provides a really vital framework. She looks at objectification and draws a thick line down the middle,
Okay, separating what?
separating permissible objectification from impermissible objectification.
Wait, so there is a healthy way to objectify someone?
Absolutely. Think about your diner example. Yes, you are interacting with the waiter to fulfill a specific instrumental need. You want eggs. But in a normal, polite interaction, their underlying humanity is still respected.
Right, I'm not a monster.
Exactly. If the waiter tricks and falls, you don't just step over them and demand your coffee from the next available unit.
Right. I gasp, I ask if they're okay. My human empathy kicks in immediately.
Exactly. Nussbaum also points to consensual, joyous, intimate relationships. Partners might temporarily treat certain parts of each other's bodies as instruments of pleasure, right?
Sure.
But it happens within a broader context of mutual respect and recognized humanity. The humanity is the safety net beneath the interaction.
I see. So the interaction relies on their humanity rather than ignoring it.
Right. Dehumanization, in Nussbaum's view, lives entirely in the impermissible subset. That is when instrumentality crosses the line into complete denial of autonomy.
Which looks like what, practically?
It's when you treat a person as fungible.
Fungible. That's a great word.
Yeah, fungibility is a key word here. It means treating someone as totally, perfectly replaceable, like a standardized factory part, or treating them as violable, meaning you can break their boundaries without even a tacit acknowledgement that a boundary ever existed.
Wow. Fungibility makes me think of assembly line labor, or maybe how massive corporations sometimes view unskilled workers.
Very much so.
Like, if worker 402 breaks down, you just slot in worker 403. The individual human characteristics are completely irrelevant to the system.
Exactly.
But I saw another philosopher in the source text, Mari Mikkola, who takes this idea of harm and kind of shifts it away from Kantian autonomy entirely. She frames it around our interests instead.
Yeah, Mikkola's approach is actually a reaction to how difficult it is to clearly define human nature.
Because what even is human nature?
Right. So instead of getting bogged down in defining the essential philosophical trace of humanity, she focuses on legitimate human interests.
What does she mean by that?
These are the basic biological and social interests that are widely shared by our species, things that contribute to a baseline of well-being.
Give me an example.
Sure. The ability to set long-term life plans, the right to continue living, the capacity to form and maintain friendships.
Okay, so under her definition, if I lie to a friend about, say, liking their new haircut, I am doing something wrong, but I am not setting back their fundamental life plans.
No, you aren't.
But if a systemic policy deprives an entire neighborhood of the ability to seek education or safely socialize, that is an indefensible setback to their human interests.
Exactly. That policy is dehumanizing. It results in a profound moral injury.
Okay, that tracks.
And then we have another theorist, Susie Kilmister, who takes this entirely out of the realm of biology or individual psychology and puts it into sociology. She uses the framework of social ontology.
Okay, break down social ontology for me in this context. It sounds intimidating.
It's not, I promise.
Yeah.
Just think of society as a massively complex, ongoing game that we are all playing. And like any game, it has rules.
Okay, I'm with you.
Kilmister argues that being human in a society isn't just about your DNA. It is a socially constructed category governed by these rules. She divides them into two types.
What's the first type?
First, there are constitutive rules. These are the basic requirements to enter the game, like being a member of the biological species Homo sapiens. If you meet the constitutive rules, you get to play.
Got it. And the second?
Then there are deontological rules. These are the powers, protections, and rights you are granted because you are playing the game. Things like human rights, the right to a fair trial, the right to not be enslaved.
Oh, I love this analogy. So if society is chess, the constitutive rule says this specific piece of wood is a knight.
Yes.
And the deontological rules dictate how the knight is allowed to move and what it can capture.
That is a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
So for Kilmister, dehumanizing actions are those that function to actively erode someone's membership in that social category.
How so?
It is an attempt by those in power to rewrite the constitutive rules so that certain people are stripped of their deontological protections. The perpetrator is essentially saying, You no longer qualify as a piece on this board, you are just a piece of wood, and therefore the rules of the game no longer protect you.
I see the immense utility in that framework for explaining systemic oppression, and I have to push back on this entire harms-based camp here.
Go for it.
I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of a skeptical listener who's really looking at the mechanics of this. Isn't this entire approach just defining the harm rather than the act itself?
What do you mean?
Let me use an analogy. If I take a baseball bat and I completely smash a laptop, I have harmed the laptop's ability to compute. I have destroyed its fundamental purpose.
True.
But the act of smashing isn't unique to laptops. I can smash a window, I can smash a pumpkin. Aren't these philosophers essentially just saying doing bad things to humans is bad because they happen to be human?
That is a highly sophisticated critique, and honestly, it is exactly the vulnerability that critics of the harms-based approach point out.
Really?
Yeah, philosopher David Livingstone Smith argues exactly what you just laid out. He says we have to separate the mechanics of dehumanization from the generic harms it causes. Mistreating a human is obviously wrong, but is every mistreatment technically dehumanization?
Right. And there is also the anti-essentialism problem, too.
Which is huge.
Yeah, because evolution fundamentally relies on genetic and phenotypic variation. There is no single, perfectly standardized human. We are incredibly varied. So if there is no single universal human essence in biology, how can philosophers claim an action specifically harms our essential human capacities?
The anti-essentialist argument is scientifically airtight, pointing to a specific set of capacities like high-level rationality or autonomy and declaring this is the human essence is incredibly precarious.
Because what happens when a human being temporarily or permanently loses those capacities?
Exactly. Are they no longer human? This vulnerability opens the door wide to the sentientist counter-argument, which is championed by thinkers like Peter Singer.
The sentientist perspective usually aligns with animal rights, right? Focusing on the capacity to feel pain rather than the capacity to reason.
Right. Sentientists look at the harms-based approach and say, well, maybe mistreatment isn't wrong because it damages some abstract, elevated concept of humanity. Maybe torture isn't wrong because it violates my Kantian autonomy. Maybe torture is simply wrong because it frustrates an individual's basic interest in not suffering. And that logic applies horizontally across species to humans and non-human animals alike.
So from the sentientist viewpoint, the unique wrongness of cruelty isn't that it dehumanizes the victim.
No, it is that it hurts a sentient creature who prefers not to feel pain. That's it.
Okay, so the harms-based approach to the idea that dehumanization is strictly about treating someone badly leaves us with these massive philosophical loose ends. It doesn't seem to isolate the specific phenomenon we're looking for.
It doesn't.
Which means we have to cross the great divide. If the answer isn't entirely in the action, it has to be in the internal architecture of the perpetrator.
The mind.
Yes, we have to look at the psychological approach. The idea that dehumanization is fundamentally a cognitive state. It is about thinking of someone as less than human, regardless of the immediate behavior.
And this is where the interdisciplinary research bringing together psychology, neuroscience, and philosophy really explodes.
I can imagine.
The psychological approach roughly divides into two distinct families of thought. The first is categorical dehumanization, and the second is graded dehumanization.
Categorical implies a binary switch. You are either in the category or you are entirely out.
Precisely. Categorical dehumanization means the perpetrator literally judges the victim as entirely outside the category of human.
Wow.
David Livingstone Smith's subhumanization theory is the anchor here. He bases it on psychological essentialism.
What's that?
It is a well-documented cognitive bias where humans believe that things in the world have an invisible underlying essence that makes them what they are.
Like, a dog has a dog essence. Even if you paint a dog with tiger stripes, a child intuitively knows it still has the essence of a dog and won't suddenly start roaring.
Exactly. It's built into how we view the world. Smith argues that to categorically dehumanize someone is to genuinely believe they possess a subhuman essence.
And what does that entail?
Well, in the mind of the dehumanizer, this invisible essence has terrifying features. First, it doesn't come in degrees. You either have it or you don't. Second, it is inherited through bloodlines.
Oh, wow.
Third, it is completely immutable, meaning no amount of education, wealth, or assimilation can ever change a subhuman into a human. And finally, this essence grounds generalizations.
Meaning what, practically?
It allows the perpetrator to look at an entire population and think, because they have this subhuman essence, They are all inherently deceptive and dangerous.
It provides a totalizing psychological permission structure for atrocities.
It really does.
But within this categorical family, the source text highlights ambiguity theories, which I found incredibly compelling because they solve a glaring logical problem.
They do. Philosophers like Steisinger and Phillips argue that it isn't always about denying someone's biological reality.
Because that's the glaring problem, right? Ambiguity theories point out a historical reality. Perpetrators of mass violence almost always know their victims are biologically human.
Yes. They know they bleed, they know they can interbreed, they know they're Homo sapiens. The trick is that the perpetrator deploys a second, entirely non-biological concept of humanity.
They create a normative metaphysical concept of the true or real human.
Yes. It is revoking their membership to the moral club while fully acknowledging their biological species.
That is wild.
So a historical ideologue might acknowledge an outgroup as biologically human, but categorically deny them the metaphysical soul or spirit required to form a civilized culture.
And that happens today, too.
Well, absolutely. In modern psychological studies, if you ask people about a prolific serial killer, they will readily agree the killer is biologically human, but they will often say the killer is not a true human.
Because they lack a deep-seated commitment to foundational moral values. The category of human is split in two.
Exactly.
That makes profound sense of how people justify everyday exclusions. But where the psychological research gets wildly granular and honestly a bit unsettling is in the graded dehumanization models.
Yeah, this is where it gets very subtle.
Because this isn't an all-or-nothing binary switch, it is a sliding scale. We perceive people as having degrees of humanity.
Right. And the first major theory here is infrahumanization, proposed by Jacques-Philippe Lannes. It centers almost entirely on how we view other people's emotional lives.
Lannes' theory maps onto our everyday cognitive biases with chilling accuracy, doesn't it?
It really does. He distinguishes between primary emotions and secondary emotions. Primary emotions are things like fear, pleasure, panic, and rage. These are visceral, immediate, and we readily acknowledge that we share them with animals.
Yeah.
A dog can clearly feel panic or joy.
Okay, and secondary
The
emotions.
secondary emotions are complex, things like guilt, nostalgia, melancholy, jealousy, or profound aesthetic awe. We perceive these as uniquely human.
Right, because they require a concept of time, a concept of self, and moral reflection.
Exactly. Lannes found that infrahumanization occurs when we easily and automatically attribute primary emotions to an outgroup, but subtly, often subconsciously deny them secondary emotions. We look at a marginalized group and think, sure, they feel physical pain, they feel anger, they feel fear, but we struggle to imagine them feeling profound, quiet nostalgia for their childhood or complex moral guilt over a minor transgression.
They feel pain, but they don't feel grief. That is a devastating distinction.
That is.
It allows you to acknowledge their suffering on a basic level without having to engage with the depth of their soul. And that leads directly into Nick Haslam's dual model, which expands on this sliding scale by arguing there are two distinct flavors of graded dehumanization.
Right. Animalistic and mechanistic. Think of Haslam's model as a grid of human traits. If you deny someone the attributes that culture considers uniquely human traits like high-level rationality, civility, moral sensibility, and refinement, you are engaging in animalistic dehumanization.
The result is that you perceive them as uncultured, irrational, impulse-driven beasts,
Exactly.
which has historically been used to justify colonial subjugation. They cannot govern themselves, so we must govern them.
A classic historical trope.
So what is the mechanistic side?
Mechanistic dehumanization happens when you deny someone the attributes that are considered essential to human nature, even if those traits are shared with animals. These are traits like warmth, emotional responsiveness, openness, and emotional depth.
So when you strip those away, you aren't left with an animal.
No, you are left with a machine. You perceive the person as robotic, object-like, cold, inert, and rigidly programmed.
I instantly think of how we treat people in deep bureaucratic systems. Treating a telemarketer, an assembly line worker, or even a toll booth operator not as an animal, but as a faulty, frustrating piece of machinery.
Yeah.
You don't get mad at them the way you get mad at a person. You get mad at them the way you get mad at a laptop that won't connect to the Wi-Fi.
That is the exact psychological posture.
Yeah.
And Kurt Gray's mind perception thesis boils this geometry down even further into two fundamental dimensions: agency and experience.
Agency and experience.
Yeah. Agency is the capacity to plan, to intend, to do things in the world. Experience is the capacity to feel, to suffer, to sense. If you strip away agency in your mind, you view someone as a passive object, incapable of directing their own life.
And if you strip away experience.
You view them as an unfeeling entity incapable of true suffering.
And this brings us to perhaps the most staggering empirical finding in this entire stack of sources. The stereotype content model, developed by Susan Fiske and her colleagues.
Oh, this study is legendary.
They argue that when we encounter any new person or group, our brains rapidly judge them on two primary dimensions: warmth and competence. Warmth answers the question, are their intentions toward me good or bad? Competence answers, are they capable of carrying out those intentions?
This creates a matrix with 4 clusters.
Walk me through the clusters.
First, the high warmth, high competence group. This is usually your in-group, your allies, the people you admire and trust.
Makes sense.
Second, the high warmth, low competence group. This triggers pity and a desire to protect. Think of how society broadly views young children or the very elderly.
Okay, the third.
Third, the low warmth, high competence group. This triggers envy and suspicion. It is often how society views wealthy minority groups or highly ambitious women in corporate settings. You respect their capability, but you don't trust their motives.
And then there's the fourth quadrant, the low warmth, low competence group.
Yes. The people society views as neither friendly nor capable. This usually includes people experiencing severe, visible homelessness or individuals dealing with severe public substance addiction.
And the research by Lasana Harris and Susan Fiske on how our brains process this specific group, honestly, it changed how I view human biology.
It is a profound and deeply unsettling piece of neuroscience.
Describe the experiment.
Harris and Fiske placed participants in an fMRI scanner, which tracks blood flow to different regions of the brain in real time and show them images of people from these different quadrants. When humans look at other humans, a specific region called the medial prefrontal cortex, or MPFC, reliably lights up. The MPFC is the hub for social cognition. It is the hardware that recognizes, I am looking at a being with a mind, with feelings, with an internal life.
It is basically the biological engine of empathy.
Exactly. When participants viewed images of the in-group, the pitied group, or the envied group, the MPFC fired up as expected.
What?
But when they viewed images of the low warmth, low competence group, the unhoused, the severely addicted, the NPS, was literally inactive. It did not light up. It stayed dark.
The brain was processing those human beings not primarily as humans with inner lives, but fundamentally the same way it processes a pile of bricks or a garbage can.
Yes. It is a measurable neurological shutdown of social cognition. It proves that dehumanization isn't just an abstract philosophical concept or a rhetorical trick used by politicians. It is a physical event happening in the tissue of the brain.
That is terrifying, because it means the hardware itself is complicit. But we have to hit the brakes here.
Why is that?
Because as powerful and convincing as all these psychological models are, the fMRI scans, the dual models, the infrahumanization, the source text, highlights a massive, glaring critique of this entire psychological approach.
It does.
And honestly, reading the critique made me question everything we just established. I have to quote the psychologist Paul Bloom here. He looks at this vast literature and asks a devastatingly simple question. Are we just stretching the word dehumanization so thin that it means absolutely nothing?
Bloom's critique is incredibly sharp. He points out a major methodological flaw in the field.
Which is?
It seems that in much of the psychological literature, anytime research participants think badly about another group or anytime they associate negative traits with an outgroup, researchers slap the label dehumanization on it.
Right.
If we call every instance of prejudice, dislike, or stereotyping dehumanization, the concept loses all its explanatory power.
If everything is dehumanization, then nothing is. But the most devastating critique of the psychological approach doesn't come from methodology. It comes from history. Philosophers like Kwame Anthony Appiah, Kate Mann, and Johannes Lang look at the most horrific atrocities ever committed: the Holocaust, extreme systemic misogyny, racial lynchings, and they point out a massive, undeniable contradiction in the psychological theory.
Kate Mann's work on the logic of misogyny is the perfect lens for this. The psychological models tell us that perpetrators see their victims as less than human, as animals or inert objects.
Right.
But Mann argues that misogynists do not persecute women because they see them as animals or objects. They persecute them precisely because they recognize them as fully human.
Right, because you don't feel threatened by a toaster.
You really don't.
You don't feel the need to violently put a toaster in its place. You only feel the need to dominate something that you recognize as a peer, a rival, a potential usurper, or a traitor.
And Johannes Lang takes this exact same logic
Mhm.
and applies it to Nazi anti-Semitism.
What does he point out?
Lang points out that the perpetrators of the Holocaust did not interact with their victims as if they were mindless animals. If you view a creature as a mere rat or an insect, you simply exterminate it.
Right, you don't play mind games with a rat.
Exactly. But the cruelty of the camps was vastly more complex than mere extermination. It was specifically designed to humiliate the victims, to punish them, to mentally break them, and to hold them morally responsible for perceived slights.
You don't put a rat on trial for treason. You don't build elaborate performative systems to crush the spirit of a machine because a machine has no spirit to crush.
The persecution requires the perpetrator to deeply, intimately understand the victim's human capacity for shame, for psychological suffering, for social degradation, and for moral standing. The cruelty relies on human recognition.
Wow.
So the ultimate critique of the psychological approach is this. In the very worst cases of what society calls dehumanization, the victims are subjected to such profound cruelty not because their humanity is denied, but precisely because their humanity is hyper-recognized.
Which creates an absolute knot in the logic. We have just arrived at what David Livingstone Smith calls the paradox of dehumanization.
It's the big one.
How can a perpetrator simultaneously think of a victim as a subhuman object or animal like the propaganda demands, while at the exact same time holding them morally responsible, seeking to humiliate them, and fearing their human intellect?
It feels like a glitch in the matrix of human psychology.
It does. You cannot hold two completely opposing realities in your head at once and function. So how do the experts resolve this glitch?
Resolving this paradox is the central puzzle of the field right now, and the sources offer several fascinating pathways out of the maze. The first is Smith's own theory, which leans directly into the glitch. It is the theory of contradictory beliefs.
Contradictory beliefs.
Yes. He argues that the dehumanizer's brain is literally at war with itself. The cognitive and visual systems are in conflict.
Walk me through what that war looks like inside the brain.
On one hand, you have the automatic biological systems. The perpetrator's visual system looks at the victim and instantly detects a human face, human posture, human vocalizations. This automatically triggers deeply ingrained human recognition mechanisms in the brain. The biology says, I see a human.
Okay, but what about the propaganda?
Right. On the other hand, intense ideological conditioning and propaganda have installed a powerful top-down cognitive belief that this person possesses a subhuman essence. The cognition says, I know this is a subhuman.
So they are genuinely holding two completely conflicting beliefs at the exact same millisecond.
Yes, and Smith argues that this intense cognitive dissonance produces a very specific, deeply uncomfortable psychological sensation. He equates it to the feeling of uncanniness or monstrousness.
Uncanniness.
Think of the uncanny valley effect in robotics or CGI. When something looks almost human but not quite, it triggers a deep sense of revulsion and unease. When a creature transgresses our culturally sanctioned metaphysical categories appearing biologically human, but ideologically believed to be subhuman, it triggers that same uncanniness.
It is the uncanny valley, but applied to living, breathing people through the lens of ideology.
Exactly. And Smith notes that this uncanniness takes two forms depending on the context. If the victim is perceived as powerful or threatening, this unease morphs into seeing them as a demonic monster supernaturally dangerous.
And if they are weak,
If the victim is perceived as weak or subjugated, it manifests as seeing them as an uncanny, enfeebled, pitiful creature. In both cases, the paradox is resolved by synthesizing the human appearance and the subhuman essence into a new category: the monster.
that is a chilling resolution. It makes perfect sense of why propaganda so often relies on demonic or supernatural imagery.
It does.
Another resolution to the paradox goes back to those ambiguity theories we mentioned earlier, the idea of multiple concepts. De Ruyter and Phillips argue that there is actually no paradox at all, provided the perpetrator is using two entirely different dictionaries in their head at the same time.
Right. If you possess two distinct concepts of what it means to be human, you can affirm one while denying the other without contradiction.
So affirming the biology but denying the soul.
The perpetrator recognizes the victim is biologically human, which explains why they know the victim feels pain, shame, and fear. That accounts for the sadistic, humiliating cruelty. But simultaneously, the perpetrator completely denies that the victim is normatively human, meaning they strip them of all moral standing and empathy.
You affirm the biology to exploit their capacity for suffering, and you deny the normative status to silence your own conscience.
Exactly. It is a terrifyingly efficient psychological compartmentalization.
Which brings us to a third resolution proposed by Noor Kitaili and Alexander Landry. They suggest we should abandon the binary concepts entirely and look at how people grade each other against a Platonic concept of the ideal human.
It is about simultaneously affirming and denying different aspects of humanity based on an impossible ideal.
Give me an example.
Let's imagine that in a perpetrator's mind, the ideal human requires two distinct pillars: high intellectual capacity and high moral character. The perpetrator might look at an outgroup and fully recognize their high intellectual capacity.
Which explains why the perpetrator fears them, views them as devious rivals, and actively plots against them.
Precisely. Because you don't fear a rat outsmarting you in the stock market or the political arena.
Right.
But while affirming their intellect, the perpetrator completely denies the second pillar, their moral character. Because the outgroup falls short of the perpetrator's Platonic ideal of full humanity, they are graded as less human overall.
Wow.
Their human intelligence is actually weaponized against them in the perpetrator's mind. It makes them more dangerous, even while their moral humanity is denied, justifying their persecution.
So you can be human enough to be a threat, but not human enough to deserve mercy? That resolves the paradox neatly.
It really does.
And the final major resolution to this puzzle is pluralism, championed by philosopher Maria Kronfeldner. Her argument is that the paradox is just a mirage caused by academics relying too heavily on abstract definitions.
She says we are confusing ourselves by trying to find one single, unified theory of dehumanization.
What does she propose instead?
Kronfeldner argues that dehumanization isn't a single monolithic event. It happens on multiple levels of reality simultaneously: the behavioral level, the cognitive level, and the rhetorical level. And these levels don't have to be perfectly synchronized.
Meaning I can be doing one thing behaviorally, but thinking something completely different cognitively.
Exactly. Think of a mid-level bureaucrat in a totalitarian regime. Cognitively, this bureaucrat might fully know that the people they are processing are human beings. They don't believe in a subhuman essence. They don't literally think they are animals.
They might even acknowledge their humanity rhetorically in private.
Yes. But if, at the behavioral level, that bureaucrat signs papers that systematically strip those people of their rights, seizes their property, and forces them into labor camps where they are treated as fungible commodities, the bureaucrat is still engaging in profound dehumanization.
The paradox disappears when you realize that a perpetrator can fail to dehumanize you in their private thoughts, but successfully lethally dehumanize you through their actions and the systems they uphold.
That brings us full circle. It bridges the harms-based approach, treating someone badly, and the psychological approach perfectly. It is all part of the same brutal ecosystem.
It is, but as we transition from the theory to the real world, I have a very practical question about the science behind all this.
Sure.
All these complex psychological models, the multiple concepts, the sliding scales, how do researchers even measure this accurately?
It's notoriously difficult.
I mean, if a psychologist brings a participant into a lab and explicitly asks, hey, do you view that minority group as subhuman? The participant is going to lie, right? Social desirability bias is a massive factor. People know the polite answer. How do we test for dehumanization without people just hiding their true thoughts?
It is a major methodological challenge, but researchers have developed incredibly clever ways to bypass that filter. They divide their tools into two categories: explicit or blatant measures and implicit or subtle measures.
Okay.
And frankly, the results from the explicit measures are the most shocking because they prove that people don't hide it nearly as much as we'd assumed.
Wait, really? People openly admit to it on a survey?
Yes. The most famous explicit measure is Noor Kitaili's Ascent of Human Scale. It is jarringly straightforward.
How does it work?
Researchers show participants the classic, recognizable image of evolutionary progress. The famous illustration starting with a knuckle-walking ape on the left, slowly standing up and evolving into a modern, upright human on the right. Below this image is a simple slider, ranging from 0 to 100.
Okay.
Participants are asked to rate how evolved or human-like they perceive various social, ethnic, or political groups to be by moving the slider.
And participants actually drag the slider down toward the ape for other modern human beings, blatantly knowing a researcher is watching.
Shockingly, yes.
Uh-huh.
The researchers fully expected everyone to just leave the slider at 100 for all human groups due to social desirability bias. But they found that significant portions of the population are highly willing to blatantly, explicitly rate outgroups as less evolved, less human than their own group.
That is deeply disturbing.
It is a conscious, overt belief. But of course, many people do hide their biases, and that is where implicit measures come in.
How do you measure a bias someone won't admit to, or maybe doesn't even know they have?
Psychologists use tools like the implicit association test, or IAT. A pioneer in this specific area is Philip Atiba Goff. Implicit tests measure reaction times in milliseconds.
Oh, I've heard of these. You sit at a computer, right?
Exactly. You sit at a computer and images and words flash on the screen. You have to categorize them as quickly as possible. The theory is that if two concepts are already strongly linked in your subconscious brain, you will react faster when they're paired together on screen.
And if they aren't linked?
If they are not linked, your brain takes a few extra milliseconds to process the pairing.
So it bypasses the conscious filter by relying on raw neurological processing speed. What did Goff's research uncover?
Goff and his colleagues used these tests to look for subconscious animalistic dehumanization in the United States. And they found robust evidence that there remains a deeply ingrained bidirectional association in many people's subconscious minds, linking Black people to apes.
Wow.
When primed with images of apes, participants were faster to identify images of Black faces, and vice versa.
Yeah.
It operates entirely beneath conscious awareness.
It is a direct, measurable, and tragic psychological legacy of centuries of historical dehumanizing propaganda that still haunts the cultural subconscious.
It is in the water supply of our culture, altering how the brain processes reality before a conscious thought is even formed.
Which naturally leads us to the biggest, most existential question of all. Why?
The big why.
Why did biological evolution or human society equip us with the neurological software to do this to each other? The source material divides the answers into ultimate explanations, the broad evolutionary macro-level reasons, and proximate explanations, the immediate situational local triggers.
Let's start with the macro.
What is the ultimate evolutionary reason for this cognitive mechanism?
The primary ultimate explanation is surprisingly rooted in our pro-social nature. Humans are deeply social, cooperative animals. For early hominid tribes to survive, evolution had to build in an automatic biological inhibition against killing members of the same species.
So for the vast majority of human beings, the act of taking another human life face-to-face is psychologically traumatic.
It causes profound moral injury to the perpetrator.
Evolution installed a safety switch to stop us from slaughtering our own tribe.
Yes. But as tribes expanded into competing societies, that safety switch became a liability in warfare and resource competition. Dehumanization evolved, or was culturally developed, as a psychological hack.
You'll work around.
It is a cognitive workaround designed specifically to disable that biological inhibition. If you can convince the brain that the enemy is not actually a human being, the safety switch doesn't engage, and the psychological trauma of killing is bypassed.
David Livingston Smith points to a deeply illustrative, though profoundly dark, historical detail regarding this hack, doesn't he?
He does. He looks at Heinrich Himmler, the primary architect of the Holocaust. In the early stages of the genocide, Nazi death squads, known as the Einsatzgruppen, were executing victims face-to-face via mass shootings.
Right.
Himmler observed that despite immense ideological indoctrination, his soldiers were experiencing severe psychological breakdowns, alcoholism, and trauma. The innate human recognition inhibition was overwhelming their ideological conditioning.
The face-to-face contact with human suffering was destroying the perpetrators.
So the biology was fighting back against the ideology.
Exactly. So what did they do?
Himmler and the Nazi hierarchy helped design and implement the gas chambers. It wasn't just about industrial efficiency, it was a mechanical, architectural solution to a psychological barrier.
Wow.
The system was meticulously designed to physically distance the perpetrators from the victims. It removed the humanity of the victims from the perpetrator's immediate sight and hearing, minimizing the sensory triggers that caused more revulsion. It was the ultimate engineered manifestation of the psychological hack.
That is incredibly bleak. But it perfectly illustrates why the mechanism exists and how it is manipulated. The sources also mention a few other ultimate explanations, right? Like terror management theory.
Yes, terror management theory suggests that we dehumanize others to cope with our own existential terror of mortality. We project our fear of death and decay onto an outgroup, viewing them as animalistic and mortal, while viewing our in-group as culturally immortal.
And there's also the simpler idea of empathy exhaustion.
Which is deeply relevant to modern life. Empathy requires immense cognitive and emotional bandwidth. If you deeply, truly empathize with the suffering of every single person on Earth, you will experience catastrophic psychological burnout.
So we subconsciously use graded dehumanization to restrict our circle of moral concern.
Yes. We dim the lights on the humanity of distant strangers to save our emotional bandwidth for our immediate family and tribe.
It is a defense mechanism against a world with too much suffering. But what about the proximate causes? If those are the deep evolutionary reasons, what pulls the trigger in the moment? What makes a specific person in a specific situation suddenly engage in dehumanization?
Approximately, psychologists look at personality traits and transitory mental states. There are certain personality profiles that heavily correlate with harboring dehumanizing thoughts.
Like what?
Individuals who score high in narcissism, those with high right-wing authoritarianism, meaning a strong desire for order and obedience to a strong leader, and those with high social dominance orientation.
Social dominance orientation.
It is a belief that society should be structured in a strict hierarchy, where some groups dominate others.
Ah, I see. If you believe the world is naturally a ruthless hierarchy, dehumanization is just the tool you use to keep people on the bottom rungs.
Precisely.
But what about states of mind? What if I don't have those personality traits, but I am put in a specific situation?
Transitory emotional states are massive triggers, and the most potent one is disgust.
Disgust, like physical disgust.
Physical and moral. When humans experience physical disgust, like smelling something rotten, or moral disgust, like hearing about a taboo violation, the threshold for dehumanization drops dramatically.
That's fascinating.
Perceived threat is another massive trigger. When we feel our physical safety or even our cultural identity is threatened by an outgroup, our brains rapidly deploy dehumanizing stereotypes as a defensive shield.
And then there is a fascinating, highly dangerous social feedback loop called meta-dehumanization.
Meta-dehumanization.
Break down that prefix for me. Is that when we dehumanize someone specifically because we believe they are dehumanizing us?
That is exactly it. It is a psychological mirror effect. If an individual or a group perceives that an outgroup views them as less than human, they think we are animals, they treat us like objects, the natural defensive psychological reaction is to aggressively dehumanize the outgroup in return.
If they think we are animals, then they must be soulless monsters.
Yes. It creates a reciprocal, accelerating spiral of hostility that is incredibly difficult for diplomats or conflict mediators to break, because both sides feel entirely justified by the other's perceived cruelty.
And I imagine this spiral doesn't just happen organically. It is frequently accelerated by deliberate language and propaganda.
Language is the primary accelerant. The philosopher Lynn Tyrrell has done remarkable research on the linguistic mechanics of the Rwandan genocide.
What did she find?
She didn't just look at the radio broadcasts as hateful noise. She analyzed them as active speech acts. The propaganda constantly referred to the Tutsi minority, using specific terms for snakes and cockroaches.
Right.
Tyrrell argues these weren't merely insults designed to hurt feelings, they were epistemological tools. The repeated language actively trained the Hutu citizens to alter the fundamental metaphysical categories in their minds.
It systematically redefined their neighbors as vermin, paving the cognitive way for mass violence without triggering the biological inhibition against murder.
It rewrote the constitutive rules of society through the radio.
Which brings us to a critical pivot point in this deep dive. We have explored the Kantian philosophy, the fMRI scans, the evolutionary theories. Now, what does this all mean for the world around us?
We need to look at specific, real-world contexts where dehumanization lives in the architecture of society.
And as we move into these applied contexts, we will encounter deeply complex, historically fraught, and highly politicized issues.
We definitely will.
Yes, and I want to be crystal clear to you, the listener, as we dive into these examples. Our mission here is not to litigate history or to endorse a specific political worldview. Our goal is purely to impartially report the philosophical, psychological, and historical findings presented in the source text to help us all understand the mechanics at play.
Exactly. We're just looking at the machinery.
Let's start with the most extreme macro-level context: genocide and war.
In the academic field of genocide studies, dehumanization is universally recognized not just as a byproduct of violence, but as a necessary precursor and an active catalyst.
Like the radio broadcasts.
Right. We mentioned the Rwandan propaganda, but this is a structural feature of almost all mass violence. Gregory Stanton's highly influential genocide watch model, which breaks genocide down into recognizable stages, places dehumanization as a distinct, critical stage.
It is the preparatory phase that readies the perpetrator's psychology to overcome their innate revulsion to murder. It is the psychological mobilization of an army.
But we see this operating in conventional warfare as well, not just genocides.
How so?
In modern psychological lab studies, researchers have found a direct predictive link. If you measure a citizen's level of dehumanizing thoughts toward a military rival, for instance, measuring how heavily they rely on mechanistic or animalistic stereotypes, that measurement directly predicts their support for horrific military actions.
Wow.
High levels of dehumanization strongly correlate with public support for the torture of prisoners of war and support for indiscriminate bombing campaigns that cause massive civilian casualties. The cognitive shortcut actively turns off the moral brakes of the electorate.
We also see this conceptual architecture deeply intertwined with the history of race and slavery.
Deeply.
The sources explicitly link the concept of racial essentialism, the belief that a race has an immutable, inherited biological essence, directly to the attribution of a subhuman essence. The entire historical justification for the transatlantic slave trade was built on this intellectual foundation, wasn't it?
It was entirely dependent on it. The historian George Frederickson analyzed the ideological framework of American slavery and observed that it relied heavily on two alternating, seemingly contradictory tropes.
What was the first trope?
The first was the trope of the childlike slave. This idea has ancient philosophical roots, going all the way back to Aristotle's concept of natural slaves. Aristotle argued that some humans simply lack the capacity for high-level rational deliberation, and therefore they inherently require the parental guiding hand of a master to survive.
Which is a brilliant, insidious trick. It frames utter subjugation as a benevolent act of caretaking. The 16th century Spanish philosopher Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda used this exact same Aristotelian logic to justify the violent conquest and enslavement of indigenous peoples in the Americas. By stripping their intellectual agency, you justify total control.
Exactly. The first trope denies agency. The second trope used by slaveholders was the beast-like slave.
Which framed them how?
This framed enslaved individuals not as dependent children, but as wild, hyperphysical, subhuman creatures that required violent taming and physical dominance. By constantly alternating between these two poles, stripping agency to justify paternalistic control, and stripping human emotional experience to justify physical brutality, the ideology of slavery attempted to create a watertight philosophical justification for unimaginable cruelty.
But the historian Winthrop Jordan points out a profound historical paradox that cracks that ideology wide open.
It's the ultimate paradox of dehumanization.
He noted that while slaveholders constantly referred to enslaved people as subhuman beasts in their political rhetoric and diaries, their actual daily behavior betrayed them. Slaveholders had incredibly complex, intellectually demanding, and often sexually intimate relationships with enslaved people. They relied on them for skilled labor, engaged them in complex dialogue, and subjected them to calculated psychological manipulation.
And you don't do those things with a literal beast of burden. You don't have complex verbal negotiations or intimate relations with an ox or a mule.
Precisely. Jordan argues that this behavior proves the slaveholders inherently knew they were interacting with complex human beings, despite their own relentless propaganda. It is the paradox of dehumanization in its rawest, most undeniable historical form.
They simultaneously believed the economic and political propaganda of the subhuman essence, while their daily granular interactions constantly affirmed the victim's undeniable humanity.
Let's move from historical systems to a modern structural context. The criminal justice system. We touched on visual processing earlier, but the research by psychologists Eberhardt, Fincher, and Tetlock regarding how we perceive criminals is staggering.
They call it perceptual dehumanization.
What does that mean?
When laypeople look at the faces of convicted criminals, they literally, neurologically process the visual information differently than when looking at non-criminals.
Wait, really explain that mechanism to me. How does the brain process a face differently?
Normally, when we look at a human face, our visual cortex uses configural processing. We don't see an isolated nose, then an eye, then a mouth, and logically deduce that as a face. We instantly see the entire arrangement as a single unified gestalt. It is a holistic, immediate recognition.
Okay, that makes sense.
But Fincher and Tetlock found that when participants know they are looking at the face of a stigmatized criminal, they tend to shift to non-configural processing.
Meaning they perceive the features separately, almost like a composite sketch?
Yes. They process the features individually rather than as a holistic human gestalt. And this non-configural processing actually makes the face appear subtly less human-like, less relatable to the viewer. This isn't a conscious choice. It is a perceptual shift dictated by a social label.
And this perceptual dehumanization has massive real-world consequences.
It does. It makes it psychologically far easier for a jury or a society to endorse harsh, retributive justice like the death penalty or extreme sentencing over empathetic models of rehabilitation.
If the visual system doesn't register a full human, the moral system doesn't demand human mercy.
Exactly.
And proponents of the harms-based approach, like the philosopher Federica Coppola, point out that specific practices within the justice system are fundamentally dehumanizing in their application. Solitary confinement, for instance, isn't just punishment, it physically strips away a person's biological capacity for human relationality.
Right, it treats the human as a physical object to be stored in a concrete box, rather than a social creature that requires interaction to maintain sanity.
Which naturally bridges us into another highly contested area of society, sex and gender.
A very complex area.
The concept of objectification is obviously central to feminist philosophy, the systemic treatment of women as mere sexual objects, but the debate within the field regarding how this actually works is fascinating.
Right, because earlier we discussed thinkers like McKinnon and Dworkin, who argue that treating women as sex objects reduces them to less than human, stripping their Kantian autonomy.
But Mari Mikkola's argument really stood out to me as a counter-perspective.
Mikkola argues that we might be misdiagnosing the mechanics of misogyny. She contends that in many cases of severe systemic misogyny, the perpetrator isn't actually treating the woman as a literal object. They are treating her as a subject.
Wait, a subject?
Yes, the misogynist fully knows she has a mind, feelings, desires, and goals. The dehumanization occurs not through ignoring her subjectivity, but because the perpetrator specifically aims to hamper, frustrate, and dominate her self-determining life plans.
So it isn't about ignoring her humanity. It is about actively subjugating it. You want to control a conscious subject, not just interact with an inert object. The cruelty relies on knowing she has a life plan that you can deliberately destroy.
Exactly.
We see similarly complex and deeply controversial dynamics in the context of disability.
In the darkest chapters of history, the connection is obvious. The Nazi T4 campaign, which systematically murdered disabled children and adults, relied on what David Livingston Smith calls enfeebling dehumanization.
Enfeebling dehumanization.
Right. The propaganda framed disabled individuals not as demonic threats, but as docile, non-threatening subhuman burdens, useless eaters, which justified horrific eugenics programs.
But the source text also dives into a massive current controversy in modern moral philosophy regarding disability, centered heavily around the work of philosopher Peter Singer.
Yes, I know Singer's work is incredibly controversial. Break down his argument regarding moral status.
Okay, so Singer is a utilitarian and a sentientist. He argues for a capacity-based moral status. He contends that moral standing shouldn't be granted simply because an entity possesses human DNA.
Instead, it should be based on what?
It should be based on the cognitive capacities a creature has, specifically the capacity to suffer, to experience life, and to anticipate the future. Based on this strictly capacity-based logic, Singer has controversially argued that a human being with profound, severe cognitive disabilities might technically have less moral standing than a highly sophisticated non-human animal, like a healthy adult chimpanzee or a dolphin.
And disability scholars are rightfully outraged by this philosophical framing.
Deeply outraged. Prominent scholars like Leisha Carlson and Eva Feder-Kitte argue that these philosophical comparisons are not just academically flawed, they are inherently physically dangerous.
How so?
By comparing cognitively disabled humans to animals, these philosophers are engaging in literal animalizing rhetoric. Kitte argues that by denying that being a member of the human family is morally significant in and of itself, philosophers like Singer risk granting intellectual cover to the exact same utilitarian ideologies that have historically been used to dehumanize, institutionalize, and oppress disabled individuals.
It is a stark reminder that abstract philosophical debates in university halls have real, immediate stakes for vulnerable populations.
They absolutely do.
The last context here is medicine, and it contains a concept that genuinely twisted my brain into a knot.
Oh, functional dehumanization.
Yes. Researchers Hake and Waits make a distinction between non-functional dehumanization, which is just standard prejudice or bias in a hospital setting, and functional dehumanization.
Wait, is there a legitimate academic argument that dehumanizing someone in a medical setting is actually necessary?
It is highly controversial, but it is a fascinating functional concept. Think about the daily reality of a trauma surgeon in a busy emergency room. They are operating on victims of horrific accidents or violence.
Okay.
If that surgeon looks at the patient bleeding on the table and vividly, deeply imagines their complex human life, their grieving spouse in the waiting room, their unfulfilled dreams, their deep human capacity for terror and pain, the surgeon might become so overwhelmed by empathetic distress that their hands shake, they might freeze. Empathy becomes an obstacle to the mechanics of saving a life.
Precisely. Hake and Waits argue that viewing a patient as a mechanical system with interacting biological parts, which is the literal definition of mechanistic dehumanization, frees up a doctor's cognitive resources. It allows them to focus purely on clinical problem solving. It reduces the emotional friction of the procedure and guards against severe clinical burnout.
You save the physical body by temporarily blinding yourself to the soul.
Basically.
But from the patient's perspective, that is terrifying. To wake up in a vulnerable state and realize the person caring for you views you as a meat machine. The debate must be whether this functional dehumanization eventually corrodes the patient-caregiver relationship entirely, turning healthcare into a cold, alienating, and ultimately less effective system.
It is the ultimate tightrope of medical ethics. How do you maintain the clinical detachment required to operate while maintaining the human warmth required to heal?
It's a huge question.
As we near the end of this incredibly dense deep dive, I want to clarify a lingering semantic issue that I know some listeners are probably grappling with. We have used the words dehumanization and objectification almost interchangeably over the last hour or so.
We have.
Are they just two different words for the exact same phenomenon?
Not necessarily. The source material maps out the theoretical landscape by showing 5 distinct ways philosophers relate these two concepts. Think of them as 5 different sets of Venn diagrams.
Okay, lay out the 5 scenarios.
Scenario 1. They are equivalent. 2 circles perfectly overlapping. In this view, turning someone into a thing is the only way to dehumanize them. And dehumanizing them always means turning them into a thing. They are synonyms.
Makes sense. Scenario 2.
Scenario 2. Objectification is a type of dehumanization. Picture dehumanization as the giant circle. Inside it you have animalistic dehumanization, and you also have mechanistic dehumanization. In this view, objectification is simply another word for the mechanistic subset.
Got it.
Scenario 3. Dehumanization is a type of objectification. This is Nussbaum's view, which we discussed earlier. Objectification is the giant circle. A large part of that circle is permissible, like consensual intimacy or polite transactional encounters. The impermissible, harmful, toxic sliver of that circle is what we call dehumanization.
So far, so good. What is the 4th scenario?
Scenario 4. They are partially overlapping. 2 circles that cross in the middle. The overlap in the center is when you treat a human being purely as a tool, like a slave. That is both dehumanizing and objectifying.
But the non-overlapping parts are distinct.
Right. For instance, seeing someone as a wild, irrational beast is dehumanization, but you aren't treating them as an object. And conversely, using an actual literal ox to pull your farming cart is objectification, treating a living thing as a tool, but it isn't dehumanization, because the ox was never human to begin with.
That makes perfect logical sense, but the 5th scenario is what threw me.
Scenario 5. They are completely distinct. 2 completely separate circles that never touch.
How can they be completely distinct? We just spent an hour proving how deeply connected they are.
Because of the great divide we started with at the very beginning of the episode. Remember David Livingstone Smith's argument. He posits that dehumanization is strictly an internal psychological state. It is purely about how you think.
In objectification?
Objectification, conversely, is strictly a behavioral state. It is purely about how you treat them in the physical world. A thought can cause a behavior, and a behavior can reinforce a thought. They are intimately connected in reality. But categorically, like an electron and a proton, they are fundamentally different categories of existence. You cannot be both a thought and an action.
Wow. That is a brilliant way to categorize the chaos of the field.
It really organizes it nicely.
Okay, let's bring this all together. We have traveled an immense heavy distance today. We started with the abstract Kantian theories of autonomy and the harms-based approach.
We did.
We navigated the chilling psychological architecture of infrahumanization, looking at how our medial prefrontal cortex can literally, biologically shut down when we look at an unhoused person. We wrestled with the profound paradox of treating someone like a subhuman animal while simultaneously holding them morally responsible like a human peer.
And we traced how these internal, invisible cognitive shortcuts manifest in the physical world. building the structures of genocide, justifying historical slavery, influencing jury verdicts, and even operating in the quiet, sterile rooms of a hospital.
Exactly. What stands out to you listening right now is hopefully the realization that dehumanization is not just a historical event locked away in black and white photos from World War II.
Not at all.
It is an active, everyday, pulsing cognitive shortcut. Our brains use it right now, today, to navigate stress, to justify our political ideologies, and to maintain our comfortable social hierarchies. It is happening in our political rhetoric, in our criminal justice system, and in our own minds when we get irritated by a stranger spilling our coffee on a crowded street.
And if I could leave the listener with one final, incredibly provocative thread to pull on, it builds directly off our discussion of Medicine and Haslam's dual model.
Let's hear it.
We spent a lot of time talking about mechanistic dehumanization, the act of treating a fellow human being like a robot, stripping them of warmth, emotional depth, and experience. But look at the trajectory of our modern technology. We are entering an era where we are increasingly interacting with actual AI caregivers, AI companions, and highly sophisticated conversational algorithms.
Right.
We are naturally starting to anthropomorphize and humanize our machines. The provocative question for the next decade is this. If we start actively humanizing our AI, granting them agency, empathy, and experience in our minds, will that cognitive habit make it easier or
Right.
significantly harder to avoid mechanizing our fellow human beings?
That's a profound thought.
As the line between human and machine blurs in our daily interactions, will we forget how to recognize the messy, inefficient, beautiful reality of true human nature?
That is a staggering, slightly terrifying question to end on. Because whether it is a highly advanced AI speaking to you on a screen, or the flustered, messy person who just bumped into you on a crowded city street, the challenge remains exactly the same. Fighting the innate biological and cultural urge to see a simplified object, and choosing deliberately to see a mind. Well said. Thank you for bringing such an intense, vital stack of sources to the table for this deep dive. Keep questioning the way you see the world, keep interrogating your own cognitive shortcuts, and we will catch you next time.